and welcome to our fourth webinar in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub's Expanded Horizons series, which is brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the Wagaya people, who are the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining you from today, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which each of you are joining us today. I want to pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present today. My name is Prue Cook. I'm from Nine Creeks Consulting and I'm your webinar host across this series. This series challenges you to think differently regarding how we approach extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. During the series, yes, Theo, this is recorded. You will get a copy of that. Thank you. I can see your copy there. During the series, we'll expose and engage hub partners, collaborators, and the broader community with novel thinking and new ideas from other sectors, industries, and countries to stimulate new approaches to extension to help drive meaningful practice change for our communities. Our guest today is Courtney Ramsey, who's actually sitting with me here today from the Grains Research and Development Corporation. And with Courtney, we're going to be exploring how we can use findings from behavioural science to design great RD&E. Now, we're not using a PowerPoint stand and deliver type presentation. That's not what we do through this webinar series. We just have a discussion format. So it's going to be Courtney and I having a chat, and we invite you to participate in a way that suits you. So this can be by putting comments for your own experiences, challenges, opportunities in the chat at any stage. We can also invite you on stage to be part of the chat verbally if that works better for you. And we've got a couple of polls, and Courts has provided a lot of really useful handouts that we'll be sharing throughout the course of our conversation today. So if you keep an eye on your screen, you'll see those pop up throughout the course of our discussion. And Theo, are we able to record this? Yes, this is absolutely recorded. You will be sent a recording as soon as this ends. So if you have to leave for technical reasons or you need to leave early, that will be popping up in your inbox. All right. Now, Courtney, over to you. You've worked several different jobs in lots of different capacities, starting off in research, and you're now sitting as a grower relations manager, which is a real farmer engagement focusing role and really strong on the extension. Tell us about how you got to do what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a bit of a motley crew kind of story. But as you say, I started out in research. So I started out my career in functional genomics, looking at salinity tolerance, and looked at herbicide tolerance as well. So for a number of years, I worked running research trials through South Australia. Went home on the family farm for a bit, and then actually did a little bit of a stint in politics before I came to work for GRDC. I initially started in a corporate affairs role, so you might know no behavioural science accreditation in there, just a passion of mine.
And so you do have this really strong interest in behavioural science. How did that come into being, and why do you think that understanding that human behaviour is really important for agricultural RD&E?
Yeah. For me, it really stemmed when I was actually in the job in politics. I picked up a book called The Brain That Changes Itself. I actually brought a copy of it along, but I'm not quite too sure what I did with it.
Left them back there, Courts.
Whoops, sorry. So I picked up a copy of this book, The Brain That Changes Itself, by Norman Doig. And it was just a really great introduction to the concept of neuroplasticity. It just really highlighted all the amazing things that your brain is actually capable of, that you can live with only one hemisphere of your brain, and that it requires attention and effort to rewire your neural pathways. And that if your brain is capable of the things that are documented in that book, what else could it be capable for, and what are we underutilizing it for? I also had the great fortune when I started working for GRDC in a corporate affairs role that the head of corporate affairs at the time, she took me along to a marketing conference where there was a presentation from the Behavioural Insights team about the application to marketing of behavioural science principles. And it was just like a light bulb went off of how much we are underutilising these hacks in RD&E.
Fantastic. And I have a lot of conversations about principles of marketing that could be applied to extension, because really it's about getting awareness of and getting someone to perform an action. Usually in marketing, it's about purchasing something, but in extension, it's fairly similar. It's about, adopting a practice, or, so a lot of good parallels there. So let's start off, as we always do, with a quick 101. What's a quick and dirty of how the human brain works?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, and look, if there's any behavioural science experts out there, if I butcher this, feel free to step in, but basically general anatomy. Back here we have our brain stem, right, in the base of your skull, right down here. And this is where we have our instinctive behaviour. It's also known as the reptilian or survival brain. And that's where we're making lots of our instinctive reactions, the things that we might not even be aware of that we're making these decisions. Like if somebody holds their hand out to shake your hand, you automatically reach out and you do it. You don't think about the fact that you're doing that.
We saw that in COVID, that everyone had to do a bit of reconditioning not to reach out a hand.
Yeah, absolutely. So that next layer of your brain out, the next closest to the body, is the limbic system, and that's where our emotional decisions and responses come from. And then right out here in your prefrontal cortex, or the neocortex, which is the outside layer of the brain, that's where we are making our logical and rational decisions. And you can see that is the furthest distance that something has to travel in terms of an electrical signal. So it takes more energy and effort. We make around 70,000 decisions a day, and the gross majority of them are made by that unconscious, decision-making process, because we're trying to conserve energy and effort. So I think that it's really important to understand that, because there are lots of hacks that our brain's making and shortcuts all the time trying to conserve energy. And just to hold up a book in front of you, but this book, Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, this is a book that I absolutely loved in terms of trying to understand some of these systematic ways of thinking. And Kahneman refers to these as System 1 and System 2, where I talked about the instinctive and the more logical, rational part of the brain. If you think about that, System 1 is the bit where we're lazy and we don't really fact check ourselves, but we're making the gross majority of our decisions there. And the System 2 is where we're doing that logical, rational thinking, but it requires a lot more effort to do so.
Perfect. Now, Courtney is holding up a number of books. She's also prepared a handout. If you've sat in on these webinars before, you know that at the very end, we do a little bit of a resource show and tell, where we talk about, the people, the organizations, the books, the podcasts, etc., that might be useful. I've got a handout that I'll share at the end of the webinar that you can access everything that she's talking about. So please keep an eye out for that at the end. Just going to share a quick poll with you now, as we keep talking about behavioural science one-on-one. So hopefully you can see a poll popping up on your screen, which is just going to help us gauge a little bit about what everyone who's listening in today does know about behavioural science. Let's keep breaking down some terminology in our 101. Behavioural science, behavioural economics, social science, what's the difference?
Yeah, really good question. It can be a really bit of a confusing minefield, because these terms are often used interchangeably, and they are subtly different, but all interrelated. So if we look at social science, that's the study of the relationships between individuals within a society or a culture, and the structures between them. Whereas if we're looking at behavioural science, we're actually looking at the study of somebody's thought processes and how that results in action in the real world, and your interactions with the external world. Where behavioural economics is slightly different is that behavioural economics is the study of those same behavioural science principles, but strictly to the application of our financial decisions. So when we're looking at agricultural practices, we're often talking about behavioural economics because we're talking about profit-making decisions, but not always that's the case. So for example, if we're looking at spray drift or industry good behaviours, we might be talking about something that's not financial. So we're basically using the umbrella term of behavioural science.
Awesome. And so this is quite useful, just seeing on our poll there, is that we've got quite a few newbies or know a little bit, but outside of a work context. So what are some well-known behavioural science experiments that people listening in might have come across? Because often, if I'm having conversations like this, people are like, I don't know anything about it. But then when you mention some well-known experiments, people are like, oh yeah, actually, I have heard of that.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear some of your experiments, the ones that you know, Prue. But I guess some really obvious ones, and maybe less so than the experiment itself, but some of the outcomes of an experiment you would see and recognize around you all the time. So for instance, when you get a household bill, who remembers getting the first graph that shows you your household usage compared to another household? That's what we call a social norm. It's trying to indicate to you if you're outside the normal parameters so that it will influence you to change your behaviour. But also on the extreme end, if you're on the end where you're less than, what your consumption is less than, yeah, exactly. You feel good about that, and you want to challenge yourself to do it better. Exactly. Another one like that is organ donation. So in the US, where we go from an opt-in system for organ donation to an opt-out system, we see a 30% increase in organ donation rates. And that's what's called, we refer to that as a default. We are lazy, inherently lazy, and therefore changing systems takes effort, and so we tend not to do it. Another example of that, a classic one, is who's still under the superannuation default scheme that you signed up to originally.
If that is you in the audience, you're still in with your original super, please put your hand up, or give us a thumbs up in the comment section.
Well, super funds tell, don't worry, you're in good company. It's the gross majority of people. So.
Perfect. So essentially then behavioural science is helping us understand heuristics, or these rules of thumbs, and cognitive biases. So let's run through some common examples of biases that we regularly come across, particularly in agricultural or rural communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I think probably as a place to start, it's probably good to break down what those two are.
Yeah,
so a heuristic, for those that maybe aren't as familiar, a heuristic is like our brain's shortcut. So it's where we're using rules of thumb, and we tend to overemphasize the importance of information that we've seen frequently or the like. So an example of that is during 9/11, we saw terrorism splashed all over the news, and people thought that the threat to life of terrorism was really high, but you actually had a greater chance of having a TV fall on you out of a roof, out of a window, and killing you. So we're inherently bad at thinking about statistics. And a bias, by contrast, is where we've got a systematic error of thinking. So a bias is sort of more, like an example of that is where we tend to think that people are who are more attractive are intelligent, or that their eyes are further apart, that we think they're more intelligent than someone whose eyes are close together. Now, we all know that that's illogical, that there's no statistical relationship between how far apart your eyes are and whether you're intelligent or not. So sorry, now coming back to your question, you were asking for some examples of what those biases and heuristics might be. So some really great, I'm just going to pick a couple because there are thousands of these, and why this book is a really great starting place, this Thinking Fast and Slow, because it documents a lot of these and the experiments that prove that they exist. Anchoring is one of them. So I'll explain to you what the experiment, one of the experiments was that talks about this concept. But so in a controlled experiment, a group of people were asked, how old is Mahatma Gandhi when he died? And one group was given some information to ask, was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 150 when he died? And then asked, how old was Mahatma Gandhi when he died? The other group was asked, was Mahatma Gandhi older or younger than 10 when he died? And then asked the same question about how old he was. Now, to all of us, we know that that's irrelevant information. We should disregard that because he was clearly older than 10. We've seen pictures. We know what he did with his life. Nobody's lived to be 150. And yet, if you look at the answers statistically, and you can experiment, you can do this with your friends, I've done this a few times, that people who were given the high anchor overestimate, his actual death was 78, they overestimate it by around about 10 years, and those that were given the low anchor underestimate it by around about 10 years. So that's one example. I'll just give you another one, which is the relativity heuristic, where we're bias, where we tend to consider things comparative to the environment around us. So consider that you have a coffee cup size. I made a very high-tech prop here, but coffee cup size, and generally speaking, if you put 3 sizes of coffee cups in front of people, they will choose the medium. And you can ask people why that is, and it's, oh, well, the little one's a little bit not quite enough, and the large one's a little bit too much. But what happens if you do this? People still pick the medium, just statistically speaking. So that's about the field of relativity. I think that's a really important one, because that's where we see in ag, like competition over the fence.
Yeah,
has the neighbour got a
absolutely.
new four-wheel drive? Is the crop looking better? You know, that's about seeing what's around you. If I could be self-indulgent, I'll just give one more.
Please do. And anyway, if anyone listening in, as Courtney says, we're not going to be able to cover all of the cognitive biases, but if you have a particular favourite one or one that you encounter regularly, please feel free to pop it in the comments.
This other one is, that I just wanted to highlight was the recency bias, because this is one that's just come up really recently, ironically, for me, in that GRDC, we have our National Grower Network, where we go on the road and we're trying to harvest opportunities and understand the opportunities and constraints that growers would like us to invest around for RD&E. And we found that when we were structuring the day, we would have an introduction from GRDC and its investments. Then we'd have a guest speaker as somebody that we'd kind of picked around the topic that we knew was going to be relevant there. And then we would do our delve into what the issues are. And we found that having the speaker first was biasing what the opportunities and constraints that were raised to us were. So we actually had to restructure our day and keep the speaker to the end of the day, so that that wasn't the only thing that they were talking about. That won't eliminate it. Like if we've got a seasonal condition, like we've just had a recent frost, you're still going to get those being the key issues that people want to talk about.
Perfect. And Renee's typed in that her favourite is the naturalistic fallacy. So if you want to give us some additional details, or give everyone some details on what that one is, Renee, that would be fantastic. All right. Courtney, do we need to make people aware of their biases when they're making decisions? You know, and if so, how do we do that?
That's a really good question, Prue, because I think there's kind of two avenues that we can take when we get to this point of understanding that we are affected by them. One is that we can make people aware that they have them, and therefore encourage them to do more logical and rational bound thinking. So try and switch them from that system 1 to that system 2 thinking, maybe jotting some things down on a piece of paper because they're complex decisions. Barry Mudge and Peter Heyman from CSIRO, they've put together adapted Kahneman's, you know, thinking fast and slow to fast graphs for slow thinking, and where they will actually map out different complicated decisions and look at different deciles, either in financial deciles or rainfall deciles, and try to give a visual on what your risk parameters are. And it's really fascinating way of doing that, of making that switch. The other thing that we can do is, well, maybe we can just hack these. We know these biases exist. Maybe we can hack into them rather and use them as to try and influence somebody to make a decision in a way that they might not know that they're being influenced. So that is something that we can do, but we also have to have a really good discussion about what's moral and ethical in that space if we're going to do that. Like what's right for one farm might not be right for the other.
Yes, and that comes across, anyone working in extension will realise that that's something that you deal with even within a similar geography. Absolutely. All right. Now, in our conversations that we've had in preparing for this, we've spoken a bit about choice architecture. Can you introduce us to that concept and some examples and how you've seen it used?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I'm going to just punch in another book example here, but this book, Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, is a behavioural economics book, and nudge is the term that they have used for designing a behavioural intervention, which this book talks a lot about what is choice architecture and how do we influence people. So I guess the choice architecture itself is trying to design. So if you're giving people two options, you can. I'm not describing this well at all here, but it's about the intervention that we can have in influencing how they make a decision. So using those biases for a particular outcome, I guess. Now, maybe it might be helpful if I run you through like maybe an example of perhaps of an experiment that's used this choice architecture.
Absolutely.
So an experiment in Israel with a behavioural scientist called Dan Ariely, they went through looking at, they had a 25% no-show rate for people for medical experiments. And they actually went through, going, well, we can prompt people. What if we give people a prompt to say, you know, you must, a week before, you know, you must turn up, and can you, and that helped. But they thought, well, what can we use in terms of the messaging that we know people are preconditioned to that actually might increase that response rate? So they designed a range of different interventions that could be tested, and i.e. different messages that were put out to people. And some of those were around, well, if you there's a cost. If you don't turn up, there's a cost to it. If you don't turn up, somebody else misses out, a whole range of different things like that. And they put them out to different groups of people and then measured the response. And nice, I think it's a really nice sort of thing for the human condition, that the message which drove the greatest response was the one that was around, well, somebody else may miss out on treatment if you don't turn up. So something positive there.
Perfect. And just Renee, yeah, the naturalistic fallacy, she says a lot in agricultural farming systems or food marketing, the bias that we have, everything natural is safe, and the best way, anything not natural, is unsafe and unethical, and it's used against genetic engineering and synthetic fertilizer. Yep,
spot on.
Yep, that's a good one. All right, let's get practical, Courtney, in terms of how, you know, we can apply this in terms of you know, agricultural RD&E projects that we might be running. So let's say you run an R&D project, it's got some compelling data, demonstrates some strong production and economic benefits. Let's say it relates to insecticide use, so it's lowering, you know, resistance problems in the longer term, but it's not adopted. What are we missing there?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Prue, because we need to do some source evaluation of some root cause evaluation of what is underpinning and driving that. I might just take an opportunity to talk through the really generic process of how you might design an experiment, and then like run through an example, because I think that will help sort of put this in the frame. So I did pop into the handout. There's a little bit of a diagram there on the concept of the status quo.
So I'm just sharing that with you all now. You should see a pop-up to download a status quo concept diagram.
Thanks for that. So this is not mine. You would have seen this thousands of times. This is a generic diagram that exists. But I guess any behaviour that currently exists is what we call the status quo, and it's a bit like the physical concept of shifting an object, where we've got forces that are opposing, and therefore the object sits at rest. And if we want to shift that object, we have to either increase the forces on one side or reduce them on the other side. So the first step that we need to take in designing an experiment is actually to set where we want to go. We actually, if you can't get to the moon if you're not aiming at the moon. So I think, and that sounds really trite, but that can actually be quite difficult to define sometimes if we want people to increase nitrogen use or decrease pesticide use like you're talking about. That's really nuanced, because it might be right in one area or not another, or do we actually want them to increase nitrogen use, or do we want them to use a protein map and nitrogen removal maps, for example. So that's the first step. And then the second part, and I think this is what you were alluding to, is to actually sit down with your target groups to understand what the issue is itself. And I think in GRDC, we tend to use a framework called a MCAT. This is also something that's in your, just a template in your handouts there. And I'd love to know what other people use, because this is not the only way of doing this, but MCAT stands for motivations, attitudes, knowledge, abilities, and technology. And when we sit down with a group of growers or whoever our target might be, so it might be agronomists, it might be as a separate cohort, they might have different drivers, so we need to have discussions with both. And we don't actually sit down and ask them to run through those things. We have a conversation where we're listening out for certain key terms, things like I will, or I believe, I think, I know, and that helps us to determine what might be those drivers and those restraining forces.
Yeah, perfect. I myself worked at GRDC left in 2016, and the MCAT was being used when I was there. So it's obviously something that has really strong resonance if it's continued, being used over all that time. And it's certainly something that I still do in my work as well too, in trying to understand. And what you said, Courtney, as well too, about making sure that you're engaging with people goes back to the July webinar that we had with Joe Eady around co-design and the importance of working with people to really understand where they're coming from. Okay, so
that's actually, you've hit on a really important thing that it's probably worth shining some light onto, but I've seen quite a few of these MCATs where somebody will try to do it themselves. And if you're doing it, how many times when you sit down, you go, you talk to somebody and they go, oh, well, a grower thinks this and a grower thinks that. And I'm as guilty as anybody of doing that. And the interesting thing about that is that if we're using that to develop this and not the group of people where you're getting an average, you're instantly biasing your results with your own heuristics there.
So can we talk about facilitating a MCAT then? So just again, to be really practical with this. So obviously you've said that you're listening out for key cues in terms of, how they might respond to those different, the different letters and what they apply to. How many people would you be wanting to talk to? What constitutes a good basis for getting a good feeling on diversity of farmer opinion when doing a MCAT?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a completely accurate answer for that, for what the right size group is. But I think when you talk to people who do quite a bit of surveying or interviewing people, generally it's once you've started interviewing about 6 people in a cohort, you start to hear some repetitive things.
Right.
And so I'd be thinking that you want at least more than 6, and probably once you start getting to around the 15 mark or so, you've probably got it pretty well captured. So that's not a definitive, and not saying you can't do it with other size groups, but that would be my sort of feel for it.
Perhaps continue until you're getting some themes emerging. And then let's talk about facilitating. So you said talking to 6, but we could do this in a group, and you said that you're listening out, but how do you structure their questions and the approaches, particularly when facilitating with farmers as well too, to try and elicit this information?
Yeah, I think it's really about that kind of the root cause analysis that you're trying to do. And I don't know who said it, but the 5 whys, well, why are we doing that? Why aren't we doing that? I think that's a really important thing, to be always asking questions. And I'll just give an example in that. So one that we did recently, we've done a MCAT on precision agriculture, and so we know we've got lots of innovators and early adopters that are using PA, but there's a big lag.
It's not widespread, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. And so with a room full of growers, we had this conversation, and the place we started at is it's too difficult. Like, that's why. But then it's about going, well, why is it difficult? What's difficult? What part of it? And so if I can give you an overall summary of the kind of the things that were talked about, they thought it was difficult because not all of our technologies talk to each other. The maps didn't, the maps were sometimes in different formats and they didn't overlay it. They weren't quite sure how to put them together.
So that's the interoperability. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. We didn't maybe trust the results of the maps because they were seasonally variable and they were different from year to year. We have technology that we're already capturing the information and the data off the machines, but we maybe don't know how to integrate that. And there's sometimes support for the use of the technologies and the software and the hardware, but maybe not for the agronomic decisions and interpreting the data. We also had this motivation around the expectation that into the future, a lot of this is going to be integrated into our machines. So maybe I'll just hold off and wait, which is interesting. And then, we also had this conversation, well, actually, there is some software available that's built to be intuitive and easy and to integrate those maps for you, even though they're in different formats. So why is that not being used? Is that still too difficult? And then it came out that, actually, no, it's too expensive. It costs $30 a hectare, $30 a month. And that was a really good starting point for the next part of the process. That identified a bunch of different drivers and restraining forces that I think if we're looking at how we might design something, that those are the bits that we're looking at, which ones can we adjust.
Perfect. So based on what you told us, that it's got that really, and that's really good example of how taking it's too difficult and really breaking that part down into different components as to what makes that difficult using that MCAT model. So you've been able to articulate what these barriers to adoption are. So what would your recommendations be then in terms of helping to shift some of that adoption?
Yeah, so I think the first step is to actually identify which one of these things are actually illogical or irrational. Yeah. And so where we might be able to have some influence over it. And I'm just going to use one of those examples from that because there's too many to cover otherwise. But so the one that I'm going to use is around the cost, so the $30 a month is a high cost. So if you look, for example, at the return on investment, $30 a hectare, $360 a year. So let's just say that we repped a $5 a hectare benefit over a 2,000 hectare area, because we might have just redistributed some of our fertilizer to areas that's more productive and we increased our yield. And that wasn't everywhere, but on average, it worked out to $5 a hectare. It's fairly modest. So that's a $10,000 a year benefit for a $306 investment. So a 27-to-1 return on investment. So somebody telling me that that's an impediment to them using the technology that's easy is, to me, illogical. So now that I know that that's the case and there's something there that we could play with, then we look at what the messages are that we could try and shift that mental framework. So for me, maybe the things that we might like to, the interventions that we design, we could do reporting of the return on investment. Let's make that upfront and really bold of what that return on investment is to challenge that. The second one we could try is maybe some relative parameters. Did you know that the average monthly cost for online streaming services is $42 a month? Suddenly $30 a month for something that makes you profit, not that expensive. Or it's $1 a day, a quarter of a cup of coffee a day. So maybe we can put it into some relativity.
Absolutely.
And we could try some social norming. Maybe there's 65% of the growers in your area are already using this, and then suddenly trying to bring them along for the journey. So some different options.
Perfect. No, fantastic. And that's, I suppose the ability to point out irrationality without necessarily saying you're being irrational as well. So doing some comparison. I'm now adding up how much my online streaming costs, and I think I need some norming there to bring it back in line. So let's talk about then some other. That's the precision ag is a really great example. Have you got some other examples that you've come across in the course of your work where you've actually seen behavioural science principles embedded in RD&E projects, and that behaviour change has occurred as a consequence? And what was the process there?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of this occurring, and not necessarily all explicit. Like, we're not necessarily sitting down to think that this is the behaviour change piece that we're designing. So I think, but there are lots of those principles at play. And one that jumps out immediately to me is the hyper-yielding crops investment that GRDC has. So this is an investment where there's a huge field site that's looking at pushing yield frontiers and what we need to get right. So they're looking at different fungicide timings, different nitrogen application timings, and a whole bunch of different things like that. And that's all shown in one trial site. But to get great engagement, they've got some focus groups of growers, some peer-to-peer learning groups. And the one that I love is that there's actually a crop competition associated with that. So each one of those members of that group are really challenged by all that competition aspect. What can I see over the fence? And then when you're seeing that new frontier, so we had the world record for canola crop last year, smashed in Australia. And so when you see what's actually achievable, that just lifts everybody else's expectations. So you might go in the high rainfall zone from having a sort of 6 ton a hectare expectation on your crop. If the hyper yielding crops is achieving 14 tons a hectare, then suddenly everybody is going, oh, maybe I can do 8 tons, And so it's just lifting the bar, and what people are achieving down there is incredible.
Okay, competition.
Another one, Prue, is a project that I think you were involved with around the Birchip, with the Birchip Group around integrated pest management.
Oh, yes. Yep.
Maybe you want to talk about that one.
Oh, that was around, and you're testing my memory here now, Courtney, but that was around looking at, we know that resistance is a problem, but still prophylactic spraying is occurring because you're already going over the country. It's just easier to put it in the tank. And often, you know, you don't realize that there's a problem until you've actually seen it. And by then it's too late to spray. So if we do it, you know, we're protecting ourselves. And so there's some cognitive biases there in terms of risk loss avoidance. You know, then not wanting to sustain crop losses as a consequence of insects coming through. So let's spray it. But obviously, you know, there's the potential resistance risks that come with that. And so we were mindful that, you know, throwing data at farmers about this is bad was not changing practice. And there was, you know, quite a litany of national research that was suggesting that, you know, we're doing the same thing in terms of workshops and presentations around, you know, why you need to rotate your chemicals, and, you know, you may not need to spray in some instances, but it wasn't cutting through. And so we sort of, you know, went back to looking at people's values as a driver for a motivator for change. And that was,
I found that so interesting because you know, those environmental messages, because everybody talks about sustainability, and that begs the question of how can we create cognitive dissonance, like that uncomfortable feeling when people maybe have one particular practices, but it's maybe not aligned to what they say their values are. So there's some real opportunity in that.
If anyone listening in's got examples where they've seen behaviour change occur in agriculture as a consequence of a project that they've worked in and how that might have been done, we'd love to hear from it. Any other examples, Courts?
I guess one going back a little way, but so in GRDC, one of our general managers is Peter Carberry, and he was really instrumental in talking to people about water use efficiency and how they can actually use some crop modelling to benchmark what their yield potential could be. And they actually ran a program that went on the road and had a farm kitchen table meetings with growers and sat across and actually sat them down and taught them one-on-one how to use this, how to interpret it, and overcome that barrier, like make it much easier to use and approachable, I guess.
So I think that's interesting, Courts, and I think that's a way of maybe addressing some hard to reach people. We appreciate that one-to-one can be really expensive when doing extension, but often a barrier can be a level of discomfort with, you know, feeling like they might not know enough or not wanting to contribute. And I've certainly seen that when I've reached out to people for projects that I've been working on, and they're like, oh, no, you can talk to someone smarter than me. I'm like, no, it's important that I talk to you too. So that's probably a good way of increasing accessibility as well too, is to do that one-on-one where it's...
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the more complex one of those changes are, then the more people want support to help. Prue, that actually brings to mind too, like one of the things that can help you design interventions, a tool that I've found really useful in the past is the EAST framework, EAST and Mindspace. They're two separate frameworks from the Behavioural Insights team, and I think they're in the resources.
I'm popping them up for everybody right now, so you'll see them pop up with an additional 2 downloads for you there.
So the EAST framework's really a simplification of the Mindspace. They started out with Mindspace, and it talks through some of the common interventions that you might like to think about. And EAST was a simplification because there was a lot in it. But I like Mindspace as a learner because it made me think through more things that I maybe hadn't previously been aware of. It's just as prompts. But EAST, the simplification one, is that if you want somebody to adopt something, you need it to be easy, simple. You know, if it's complicated, people aren't going to go there. It takes too much effort. We're like inherently lazy. It needs to be attractive, so we need to think about incentives of how do we get people into it. And profit's obviously a big one, but there's other non-financial incentives. It needs to be social, and we've spoken a lot about social norming and the power of that already. And it needs to be timely. So, like, you know, can we use push prompting or giving people the right information just in time? Yeah. Things like that.
Can we talk about the easy and simple part of that? Because often some of the stuff that we're trying to communicate with agriculture is easy and simple when we're dealing with variable seasons, and, you know, there's so many different factors at play on a farm. What happens when it's really hard to make that easy and, you know, to get that easy and simple component?
Yeah, look, the answer to that in itself isn't easy or simple either. Thanks, Prue. But I think one of the things that we often utilise as a tool in agriculture are rules of thumb. and breaking something down into its simplest components. And it's not saying, so I'll give you a great example, and this is another one of where these principles are at play, is Weed Smart. So Weed Smart, for those who don't know, is sort of the extension outfit for and it's an industry funded group. So there's GRDC is part of it, but there's lots of other chemical company representatives and the like that fund this group, and it's an extension outlet for RD&E principles, I guess. And basically, weeds, you can be as complicated as you want it to be. Like if you're talking about every single farm scenario, it's going to be slightly different how you manage it and how you want to ensure rotation and things like that. So they've gone with some overarching principles instead, and the Weed Smart Big Six. And a lot of people in this industry can probably quote to you the Weed Smart Big Six off the top of the head: mix and rotate, crop rotations and all of those different things, harvest, weed, seed control, those are really simple messages that we then adapt. So it's not saying that there's some difference between simple and simplistic, I think, in a way.
Okay. So distilling something perhaps into some high level, easily rememberable stuff, but then
as prompts for more action.
Giving the support. So that's the easy gets them to a point where like, all right, now we have to deal with some complexity. Sorry.
And look, we do use rules of thumb a lot too, as I said, but I think we know that those rules of thumb can be wrong, and so I think it's about just taking using prompts to get people to check them every now and again, do that logical system 2 thinking where we can actually check whether that still fits the system and it's still accurate.
Perfect. So stems into my next question, and then we can go into your show and tell and any questions. So if you've got questions, feel free to start typing them in. But any advice for developing communication products that consider cognitive biases and heuristics? We've had a bit of a chat about facilitating and one-on-one and doing the person-to-person understanding of. But if we're developing fact sheets or any kind of resources communicating outwards, how can we design those with behavioural science in mind?
Yeah, I think that's actually some of the really low-hanging fruit, because because this is the stuff where there's actually, to my mind, much less of a moral and ethical question about this, particularly if you're just prompting people to seek more information or to attend a field day of promotions or take more notice of the information by how you design the product, then there's not a moral or ethical question there. So that's a really interesting space. I think, this is about, we need to make sure that we approach this like we do with our RD&E experiments, where we actually have a hypothesis and we design a series of different experiments and we actually measure them. So if we're going to put out a fact sheet, maybe we have to design it 3 times, but in 3 different ways, so that we can test what messages actually work. And this is or promotion or any of those kinds of things. The measuring part's really important. We can get a gut feel for things, but then we're already biased by what those things might be. But
you've completed your own account then.
Exactly. So we do have to make sure we're measuring, and that's like inherently difficult. Measuring action and behaviour is super hard. It's super difficult unless you can, get an arrangement with Apple for Siri Intel or something. I don't know. That's very, very challenging. But so you can. One of the best lowest hanging pieces of fruit that I think that we can use is the digital sphere. We've got the last 15 years, what we've been able to capture in digital metrics is expanding all the time, and we can follow action from click-throughs of what people engage with, what they interact with, and that's a really good way to get a sum of the whole. We can measure, we can use proxies. So maybe we can, is there some point of sale that relates to the action that we're trying to measure? Can we partner with a company to get some sales metrics on if we're looking at ultra coarse nozzles for 2,4-D use in summer? Can we actually measure that to see whether any of our messaging has had an impact?
And I do remember a really good example with some lime workshops where the evaluation were, about liming and that lime sales would go up after these workshops were held in a particular region. So a really good example of where an extension is having cut through. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think obviously the other part to that is surveys, but surveys, like, that's our default in ag, and it should be the last resort.
Yeah.
Because we are, from a survey, you're going to get a bit of a gut feel of people's intent to change. Like, you can gauge that. You can make them make some commitments that might, help generate that action later. But we're actually really bad at answering surveys because we tend to censor ourselves for what we think our audience wants. Who's going to tick that they go out spraying in a temperature inversion? Like, no one's going to admit to that, for example. So if we're trying to use that to measure the behaviour change, it's going to be really hard.
So there's a lot of cognitive biases that come out in completing a survey. I did one recently for my toddler, which was about, how active and her diet and stuff like that. And I'm like, yes, I'm a good mum. She eats healthy all the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'm pretty close on the mark with that one. But yeah, I'd love people to flick us a reaction or one of your emojis to tell us how you feel about when you have to do, doing surveys with farmers or regional communities. Let us know using an emoji how they make you feel, because it's certainly something that is challenging. Well, it's challenging to get people to complete them in the first place. And then have you got enough good intel, and have you asked the right questions as well?
I think just circling back to your question there, Prue, too, about its use in communications products, is one thing that's a little bit of a tip is, unlike the MCAT, where you really have to sit down with the target audience, everyone's cognitive biases are the same.
Yeah.
So you can actually set some of your experiments with a group that's not your target audience. So if you don't want to do that in Growerland, you could sit down, you could use a bunch of uni students or something like that to maybe test those interventions on and get a feel for what's going to work as a prototype before you scale it up and send it out into the world. So that's a bit of a tip as well, because you're going to, the one caveat to that is that they need to understand the language that's appropriate for it.
Perfect. And we're getting some thumbs down for surveys, and I don't know whether you're laughing or crying or both as a consequence of having to do surveys, but I know that it's that's something particularly frustrating. So, Courtney, you've mentioned a number of books, and we've shared a couple of handouts and stuff like that. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a specific handout, which I'll share with you now, which is a number of resources that you've mentioned and that you're going to mention now. Where should, appreciate that in this, 1 hour session that we've got today, everyone's just going to have enough to get them interested. Where should people go from here if they want to learn more?
Yeah, look, I think, the things that I've put in here are from a total novice's perspective. Like I said, I'm not an expert in this field, just somebody that's really passionate about it. So I think the Thinking Fast and Slow is just a brilliant place to start of understanding all those biases and heuristics that influence us that we don't even know. And this is the first book that I bought that since high school that where I actually scribbled in all the margins, and I've got tags all over the book of every time I read. Yeah, it is. Indeed, it is. Nudge, I found, was a really great one for that introduction to choice architecture, and those frameworks from the Behavioural Insights team is a really good starter to get your teeth around for the interventions. I love the work of Dan O'Reilly. He's such an incredibly motivational speaker, and he's got his own website. He does some podcasts. He's got a book. He's got a number of books that are great reading. Rationally Irrational, something like that. I've got that quite wrong, but it's in the notes there. Predictably Irrational, sorry. But if you get a chance to look at his YouTube clips, he's just so engaging. He's just really inspire you. I would just mention too that the Behavioural Insights team do a conference every year where they get people to come along, and they often put the recordings of some of the keynote speakers onto YouTube or whatever, so that's worth Googling. And one final one, just a really applied agriculture one. There's a book called Farm Decision Making that's a GRDC publication that was put together with Cam Nicholson, Jeanette Long, and a whole crew full of people. And that's a really good sort of starter for insights into how that applies to agriculture.
Perfect. Now, we've got time for some questions if anybody wants to type them in. While you've got the opportunity to do that, I'm just going to pop up a registration link for our next webinar, And there was a bit of method to my madness in terms of asking you your thoughts about surveys, because our next webinar is going to be with Tom Leslie. He's from Quantum Market Research, and we're going to be talking about how to ask the right questions to understand what agricultural communities really want. And that will be looking at, you know, are surveys the best way to go? What can we do instead of surveys? And how can we make sure that we're asking the right questions? So Theo's just commented, it's disappointing that we use surveys. Easy for you to get badly designed ones out. Yep, absolutely. And it's all, isn't it very frustrating when you see a badly designed survey and you know, go, no, that means someone's not going to complete mine in the near future. We often use surveys because we used surveys before, because we were trained in surveys, and our weak and limited ability to push back to funders. There we go. So look, I think this session with Tom is going to be fantastic. It will be on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, just for Tom's availability. But Tom is a hands-on social market researcher with extensive field experience with agricultural audiences, and he's worked across broadacre livestock, wool, dairy and hort, ranging short interviews, community focus group and full-day immersive ethnographies, shadowing a day in the life of primary producers. So if you don't know what a immersive ethnography is, tune in October. And so Tom's recently been heading up a really interesting piece with WorkSafe around understanding culture as a driver for farm safety, and we're going to spend a bit of time discussing that as a case study. So that conversation with Tom is going to be really fantastic, so please register for that if you are interested. Not seeing any questions coming through, so with that, Courtney, thank you very much for your time today. Vicky, Prue, the registration says Thursday the 6th for Tom. I will sort that out, but it is definitely the 4th, Tuesday the 4th. That was because I set things up way too early and I was ahead of myself, Vicky. I will change that as soon as I get off this. So yes, thank you very much for everyone for participating today. We hope that this has really stimulated your thinking. If you're planning to do something different as a consequence, we'd love to hear from you. Once the webinar finishes, you're going to be directed to a survey, and I'm hoping that Tom will be able to tell me a different way that I can do this next time. It will be very much appreciated if you fill it out. 37 seconds is the average completion time, and it does help us plan and evaluate this and other activities. Thank you again for participating in today's Expanded Horizons webinar delivered by the Southern New South Wales Innovation Hub. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.